our first Freilich project event since the restart, since the pandemic. I want to start by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting, albeit virtually, and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal people, and particularly the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging. My name is Ibrahim. I'm the previous convener of the Freilich project. That privilege has been handed back to Melissa Lovell, but as the way these things works, I've been pulled back in for one final madcap adventure with Will, Jordan, and also Simon Copland, who will be joining us quite soon. The topic of this evening's discussion is the far right online. And I think that even those of us who perhaps had the misfortune of watching the US presidential debate the other day will realize just how vital and contemporary these issues are. They've really been dominating a lot of the news media in the last 24 hours with the response to some of President Trump's comments. So we'll certainly perhaps reflect on that. Just a few housekeeping issues, just for the sake of ease and convenience, and also to limit potential saboteurs, instigators. We've got the Zoom webinar rather locked down a little bit. Welcome, Simon. Just mentioning saboteurs and instigators. We've got the system actually locked down pretty well, but you are very much welcome to send a question to any of our three presenters using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there. And we'll all be able to see those questions as they come up. The plan is that we will go through to 7 p.m. Don't worry, you will have plenty of time to grab some dinner before the Port Adelaide Geelong match at 7:40 p.m. tonight. So I might hand over to, well, let me introduce very quickly our three panelists here. We have Simon Copland, a PhD candidate here at the ANU, who is researching the manosphere and issues of gender, sexuality, and politics. Jordan McSweeney, a PhD candidate from the University of Sydney, researching the organizational dynamics of the Australian far right. And Jordan is a past recipient of the Herbert and Belmay Freilich Early Career Research Grant. And if you are a PhD researcher, if you're an early career researcher doing work in this field, please visit our website, because applications are open until the end of November for the 2021 round of that Herbert and Belmay Freilich Early Career Research Grant. And we're also joined by Will Allington, who's a recent graduate, also of the University of Sydney, from the Department of Hebrew Biblical Studies. And he received his PhD for his study into online anti-Semitism and young people's ability to recognize, respond to, and refute anti-Semitic material. So I might hand over to Simon, if that's okay, and we'll get underway.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I think I was a couple of minutes late. Technology issues. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. It's really great to be here. I'm currently have been a little bit of program leave for a little while, so it's nice to be back and talking about my research. So I want to talk, as Ibrahim said, my research is on the manosphere, particularly on Reddit, but broadly the manosphere online. So I want to talk about the intersections between the far right and misogyny, and provide some ideas for how we can deal with these issues. So what I'm just going to do, firstly, I want to just sort of talk about what the manosphere is, and then I've got a number of propositions that I want us to consider about the manosphere and the connections to the far right. So the manosphere, for those who are unaware, is a collection of online blogs, forums, social media channels, etc., associated with male self-help connected to anti-feminism and men's rights. So these comprise of a number of groups, So there are men's rights groups which campaign around men's issues associated with things like family court laws, domestic violence, claiming that domestic violence against men is worse than against women, for example, and those sorts of things. Then you have people who pickup artists, or the red pill, who focus on techniques called game in order to pick up women and get relationships. And then also you've got incels, who are people who believe that because of a whole range of different genetic markers and things like that, that they're unable to get a mate and take out anger against women. And men going their own way, who are people that believe that, men that believe that relationships with women are so toxic and so negative, and that women are so toxic and so negative that they distance themselves from those relationships entirely and don't engage in romantic relationships with women at all. I'd like to start really bluntly and say that these spaces are filled with a whole range of misogyny and misogynistic tropes. In particular, these spaces are often contain sort of biologically essentialist ideas about the differences between men and women, with assumptions that women are more emotional, less rational, but also inherently selfish and more driven to selfish ends compared to men. And we've seen a whole range of, particularly from incel communities, we've seen violence that has come from these communities, misogynistic communities. So there's the Elliot Rodgers attacks, attacks in 2014, and recently in 2018, Alec Manassian sped a rented van through the streets of Toronto and killed 11 people. And there's been a number of other similar versions of these attacks, which is men who have become extraordinarily so disenfranchised and so angry that they take out their violence against women. But this is particularly targeted at women, quite frequently targeted at women. And here we can see connections between these spaces and the far right. Many have claimed that the manosphere, and there's been discussion about the manosphere being kind of a gateway drug to the far or alt-right. And we see a number of these high-level figures in the far right have connections to the manosphere. So Stefan Molyneux, who is a well-known Canadian far-right activist, has started off in manosphere with manosphere ideas. Milo Yiannopoulos was very sort of got his name through talking about Gamergate, which is a sort of classic campaign, manosphere campaign. And there's also very strong connections with the misogyny, and particularly the anti-feminism that comes out through the manosphere, and connections between that and far right discourse. The idea prominent within the far right now that social justice warriors have sort of taken over, they're stifling free speech, there are all these kinds of tropes, and there's fighting back against these ideas. That's very much connected within manosphere ideas, and you can see strong connections. So what I want to do for the rest of my talk, and I think I've spoken for about 5 minutes, so I'm going to go for another 10, because I think we have 15 minutes. I want to just establish, so clearly we can easily establish the existence of misogyny and violence and far-right tendencies within the manosphere, and these connections are really clear. But I want to sort of talk about what do we want to do with this? What do we do? How do we address it? And how can we respond to the manosphere as a space? And this is, I guess I've got sort of a number of propositions. I've here, they're all short, but they're ideas about how we can think about these spaces. In particular, we're thinking about how we can address some of the issues that exist within them. So my first proposition is that describing and labeling the misogyny and other far-right tendencies in the manosphere is not enough. It is important that we detail the kinds of misogyny that exists within these spaces. It's important that we engage in that connection between these spaces, but simply labeling it is not enough, and it's not going to be enough to deal with it. In particular, I think we've got to be careful at trying to see these spaces as inherently new or as inherently different. What we can see, particularly in the misogyny that exists within these spaces, is a range of tropes and misogynistic tropes and ideas that have existed for a long time. And in many ways, these spaces are actually quite routine. And that's not a good thing. Routine misogyny is not a good thing. It's something we want to work to overturn. But I think we have a tendency, I see a tendency to treat these spaces as inherently new, and therefore a need to come up with new ideas and new approaches. My view is that the misogyny that exists in these spaces and the far-right tendencies that exist in these spaces are often actually just repackaged versions of misogyny and far right tendencies that have existed in the past. And it's useful to think about it in that way because we have tactics and skills and things that we've learned in the past about how to deal with misogyny and far right tendencies. And that is something we should be deploying in these spaces. My second point that I wanted to make is seeing everything through the lens of masculinity is also not enough. The space is called the manosphere. It is an inherently gendered space. There is gendered tropes that run through these spaces. There's a discourse around masculinity that runs through these spaces. And we can see this play out in two kind of ways. Some fear that attacks on masculinity in recent years by social justice warriors and feminists have sort of left men being sort of purposeless in their lives, that there are previous gendered roles that were really important, gendered roles that they consider to have created more stable society, and then that's been attacked in recent years. And then you see some who actually also at the same time, but in a perverse kind of way, argue against those gendered roles and wish for them to be put away. So you see men in men's rights activist groups, for example, talk about the expectation of being the breadwinner and wanting to get rid of that. Now, perversely, they say that the reason that they're expected to be the breadwinner is because women are selfish and are refusing to do these things, and so they're expected to do it. But there's this weird, sort of this anti-masculinism that still blames women in the way that they're doing. But all these things are important. But I say that's it's not the only thing it's not the only way we can analyze these spaces. We have to analyze them through multiple different lenses. If we look at it solely through the lens of masculinity, we're not getting a full picture of these spaces. There's a whole range of issues that are existent within these communities: social isolation, economic concerns about the state of society, whole range of issues that come out frequently around family lives and histories of trauma and abuse, etc. And so we need to understand these types of things that are going on to be able to understand and theorize the misogyny that exists within these spaces. The misogyny comes out through multiple different ways, and I'll get to this in a second, but we need to be able to understand and theorize this. We can't do it just through a lens of masculinity. The third thing I want to say is that while technology and social media plays a really key role in these spaces, again, it cannot explain everything about these spaces. So social media is integral to many of these spaces. I study the manosphere on Reddit, and we have communities on Reddit that have 300 odd thousand people attached to them, and that's just one manosphere subreddit, and there are many more. And so these spaces they facilitate a lot of the activity that occurs there. And in many ways, a lot of the affordances of these spaces, the technologies, the buttons that are used, facilitate the furthering of misogynistic debate. In particular, like buttons, for example, encourage people to adopt more extremist rhetoric to gain more likes and to have a sort of this connection to a like economy. Yet at the same time, I don't think we can blame technology entirely for these spaces. And again, I think that goes to this question about, is this misogyny new? Well, no, it's not. Misogyny has certainly existed prior to technology. It now is operating in different kinds of ways. It's spreading in different kinds of ways, and we have to explain that by examining the technology. But at the same time, we cannot just see this technology is to blame. If we get rid of social media tomorrow, we're not going to get rid of misogyny. We're not going to get rid of far right ideas. And even if we change the affordance of these things, it might help, but it's not going to fix everything. Another key thing to think about there is that people move around these, get around these things. So while we can target big tech companies to change their practices, what we're increasingly seeing is a trend of people moving to smaller places, to less regulated places, where they're actually immune from a lot of the regulations that happen in big social media spaces. And that's a real worry because it actually has the potential to become more violent and more extreme. So finally, I just want to say two more things. So I think that what I've said there is, we can't just name the misogyny. We can't just talk about masculinity. We can't just talk about technology. So what else should we talk about? I think that we need to think about the deeper social issues that are at play. So for example, I think I've mentioned a few of these already. We need to examine the deep social disconnect that many of these men have. We need to examine the alienation from society, and we need to examine the feelings of purposelessness that a lot of these people have. And what my theory is, or what I'm arguing is that a lot of the narratives of the manosphere provide a very effective narrative to explain problems that a lot of these men already have in society or feel about society. And so you have a situation in which misogyny exists within a society already. So a lot of people are primed to that already. Then they often feel deep senses of social disconnect or purposelessness or alienation. And manosphere narratives are a very effective way at providing an enemy, providing a narrative to these men, but also providing a community of people who feel the same way. And we need to understand those sort of emotional connections to that narrative, to that community, but also to the deep feelings of social problems that many of these men have. And so to go finally into how to respond, and this is where I'll finish off, I think we need label and name the misogyny when we need to fight against it, but we also need to do the work to create different narratives to appeal to a lot of these people. And we must, so which means we must stand up against it, but we must point out the problems and the hypocrisy that exists in these spaces. But at the same time, we need to understand and listen to the concerns that a lot of these men have, not the misogynistic concerns, but the concerns about their lives that they have, and provide different stories about why this is happening and different narratives about how to get out of this that are not misogynistic, that are not anti-feminist in the way that we approach them. At times, this will mean, and I think this is very hard for a lot of people, at times I think this means showing empathy and engaging with these people. It doesn't mean engaging and showing empathy around misogynistic or violent attacks, but it does mean, I'm a sociologist, as sociologists we need to understand and theorize the misogyny, we just see the way that the misogyny is created. And that means potentially showing empathy. It means potentially seeing some of the good in the spaces around the support and bonding these men provide, but seeing if we can direct that good things into different directions that aren't misogynistic, that aren't anti-feminist, that don't engage in these kind of violence that we often see. I think I will finish there. I think that's probably enough.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. We're going to move on next to Jordan. But a reminder that you can, at any time during the next 40 minutes or so, ask any questions using the Q&A function, and we, the panelists, will be able to see that and we'll be able to answer them at the conclusion of the third session. So I'm very happy to hand over to Jordan from the University of Sydney now.
Great, thanks, Ibrahim. And I'll just note that I'm zooming in from unceded Gadigal land here in Sydney. I might just share my screen. Hopefully that's working for everyone. And if I can just get to the right bit. Okay, cool, there we go. Yeah, so as Ibrahim noted, my name's Jordan. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney in the Department of Government and International Relations. And tonight what I want to present on is some of my research I've done with my Freilich project grant into the way in which Australian far-right parties are using social media, namely Facebook and Twitter, with a particular focus on the 2019 federal election. So the research aims of this project are twofold, really. Firstly, I wanted to map the relations between various far-right organisations on Facebook and Twitter using social network analysis. And really, this is because access to the far right is often very limited, especially for scholars. And so the study of their digital networks can really function as a very valuable proxy for the internal life of these organisations, in that it will tend to reflect their overall organisational preferences. But secondly, I also qualitatively analyse the way that these parties use the platforms in terms of the kind of content they're sharing. And in this respect, I'm particularly interested in how these platforms are being used for things like recruitment, mobilisation, and to more broadly facilitate party organisation. So tonight I'll be focusing on 4 parties, 3 of them, Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Fraser Anning's Conservative National Party, and the Yellow Vest Alliance, are pretty clear-cut far-right actors, and as my research demonstrates, are deeply embedded within a broader Australian far-right milieu. However, the fourth that I want to talk about tonight, the United Australia Party, is something of a fringe or a test case. And I was interested in including them in the project after the party and its founder, the mining magnate Clive Palmer, started posting images with really clear far-right symbols and messages on their verified social medias throughout 2018 and 2019. So for example, a couple on the slides there. The one on the left has Clive Palmer on a stylized body of Adolf Hitler, and the one on the right points to, among other things, race mixing, trans rights and feminism as steps on the path to, quote, social degeneracy. There's also a pretty thinly veiled reference there to the anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, and I think quite notably, these images are still on Palmer's verified social accounts as of this morning. So anyway, social media is a vital tool for political parties of all stripes, but for the far right in particular, which faces added issues like social marginalisation, these platforms provide a space for the characteristically fragmented, decentralised, and often sectarian political family to connect with like-minded organisations and individuals. Internet communication technologies like social media fulfil a number of potential functions related to facilitating organisation and collective action more broadly. And this includes connecting supporters across spatial barriers and disseminating their message without the mediating role of the mainstream press, among a number of other uses. Now, in Australia, platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been integral to the revival of the Australian far right, beginning with the Reclaim Australia movement back in 2015. Though some of the more explicitly racist and fascist elements have since been removed from Facebook and Twitter, in the wake of the Christchurch massacre in particular, these platforms do really remain very vital for parties like One Nation. And in a context where access to their internal workings is especially limited, these digital structures function as a useful proxy. So to conduct my research, I take a mixed methods approach, combining social network analysis with qualitative content analysis. For the social network analysis, I take as my starting point a number of key accounts on both Facebook and Twitter belonging to these four parties, as well as a number of other Australian far-right organisations, including other parties, protest organisations and subcultural groups, and alternative media. I collected data on the ties between these and other organisations, operationalising the likes between Facebook pages and interactions like retweets and mentions on Twitter as bonds that point to pathways of communication, collective action, recruitment, and ideological affinities. This was supplemented with qualitative content analysis of their Facebook and Twitter posts for the entire period of the 2019 federal election campaign, about 6 weeks, from August 11th to May 20th. And so here I'm coding images, text, videos, a whole bunch of different kind of materials thematically with a focus on post-purpose, topic, and overarching narrative frames. So to kind of jump into the results straight off the bat, on both Twitter and Facebook, I find large but very poorly structured networks of far-right accounts. Though such a structure is unsuited to vertical coordination by a single organisation, Pauline Hanson really emerges persistently across both platforms as the most prominent actor, which underscores her importance to the Australian far right. Anti-Moss campaigns are also really big, especially on Facebook, and these provide a baseline of connectivity for One Nation, the Conservative Nationals, and the Yellow Vests, which really underlines the importance of broader social movements to these political parties. Now, notably, my test case, the United Australia Party, is very poorly connected to the broader network. What connection it does have is pretty well entirely mediated through the social media profiles for former Senator Brian Burston, who you may remember was a former One Nation senator. He became a United Australian senator after falling out with Hanson and would go on to lose his seat at the election. There's also very little connectivity among and between the parties, which I read as pointing to a competitive rather than collaborative network configuration. And in regards to the internal life of these parties, there's very little evidence of branch or regional structures on either Facebook or Twitter. And instead, the intra-party networks are dominated by the national office, leader and very select party elites, a handful of other senators and the like, highlighting a quite extensive centralization of power. Now, the structure of these networks aside, the other point is how are they actually utilizing these platforms? And really the expectations that are at the front and center of the literature are that, especially during an intense election campaign, we should be seeing, lots of materials relating to party organization and election mobilization. However, this was not borne out at all really in the data. Instead, the larger share of the posts related to the development of collective identities through the construction of quite explicit in and out group dynamics. Each of the parties constructed themselves as champions of an embattled Australian people facing some kind of dual threat, both internal, corrupt elites, the major parties, and external, China, Muslims, etc., etc. And two very distinct framing practices emerged as central to these social territories. Now, the first of this is Islamophobia, and it was absolutely central to much of One Nation, the Conservative Nationals, and the Yellow Vest content, and really formed part of their broader nativist discourses. Typically, this corresponded with topics like immigration and national security, and all three parties very explicitly framed Muslims and Islam as a clear and present threat to Australia and what they described as the Australian way of life. Now, interestingly, the UAP here does not employ Islamophobic framing. It still adopts a nativist sort of narrative, but instead it relies on anti-Chinese sentiment and framing, emphasizing the economy as well as national security. Where all four parties were united, however, was in their anti-ALP framing, constructing the ALP and especially then opposition leader Bill Shorten as untrustworthy, financially irresponsible, and weak or unreliable on questions of immigration and national security. For example, one post by One Nation reads, quote, "If Bill Shorten will lie about his family history, what else will he lie about? Is he lying about death taxes, carbon taxes, immigration, foreign aid? Bill Shorten will say anything to get elected." Now, what I think is particularly interesting here is, as part of a broader anti-elite framing, it seems perhaps counterintuitive to focus on the party not in government. But even within that, I found quite interesting this frame really reproduced many of the central themes of the coalition's own re-election campaign. The way issues like the so-called death tax and franking credits, as well as border security, were kind of picked up by these parties and really radicalized as their own sort of parody or mimicry of the government's re-election platform. So to circle back to some of the questions I was posing at the outset, I mean, what does this tell us about the four parties' relationship, firstly, to the broader far right? And what does it tell us about how they're using social media? Well, each evidently seeks to create active networks of followers through their digital activities. They utilize the connective architecture of platforms like Facebook and Twitter to develop interactive communities of engagement that don't distinguish between due-paying members and supporters. Across both platforms, these networks were largely decentralized and they're very poorly connected. What this suggests is that the Australian far right at the time of the 2019 federal election is extremely heterogeneous and is not particularly suited to vertical coordination, even if Pauline Hanson and One Nation are the leading electoral competitors. Now, while this network may not be amenable to concerted efforts at mobilisation, they nevertheless play a vital role in the dissemination of the party's messages. And this is kind of especially the case when a network is decentralised, as it is here. It also highlights the importance of local anti-mosque and anti-halal campaigns as entry points to the broader far right. And these function as potential spaces for recruitment and mobilisation. Both One Nation and the Conservative Nationals, at this election and in 2016, which One Nation contested as well, recruited candidates for election directly from these campaigns. Now, at the same time, the United Australia Party, as I noted, occupies a really marginal space, and it's only really tentatively connected to the broader Australian far right. This lack of integration suggests that the party's reproduction of far right symbols and the active recruitment of One Nation candidates, former One Nation candidates for their own election lists, is really the product of opportunism rather than ideology. And this is consistent with what little literature there is on the Palmer United Party, the party's first iteration. Now, regarding the use of the platforms, the surprising lack of organizational content present does run quite counter to the expectations in the literature on the use of the internet by the far right. Only a very small number of posts included a call to action, such as participating in campaign activities, and fewer still were aimed at recruitment. The parties instead use these platforms primarily for the construction of collective identities and the production and dissemination of frames, especially regarding Islam and the Australian Labor Party. Coalition's talking points. And this gels with what, I guess, preeminent scholar on far-right parties, Kazmuda, has talked about in terms of, rather than having original policy or ideological positions, much of that put out by the contemporary far-right political parties in Europe, and presumably in Australia now as well, is in fact simply a radicalization of existing centre-right positions. And I think this is really important when we're thinking about how best to perhaps combat the influence of these parties in our parliaments. There's often a lot of discussion that a more hardline approach to immigration, for example, is needed to retake the vote from them. But this would, of course, suggest that that wouldn't actually be the case. If anything, it would help to legitimise the positions of, say, One Nation and the Conservative Nationals and the like. So I might leave it there. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I do look forward to a fruitful Q&A at the end. Cheers.
Thank you, Jordan. And our third presentation is by Will Allington, who recently received his PhD from the Department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney, which deserves a small silent round of applause in your own home. And he's going to be talking tonight about his study into online anti-Semitism. And once again, a reminder that the Q&A function is there for your convenience. So welcome, Will.
Thanks, Ibrahim, and everyone for tuning in, and for the other presenters. I'm just also going to try and set up a presentation of my own as well. There we go. Is that all working? Yep, so my research was conducted on anti-Semitism online, but focused particularly on a number of factors: the qualitative and quantitative evolution of anti-Semitism online, its relationship with other forms of abuse, hate, and misinformation, particularly on the far right, and developing potential research methods that might be used to study other extremist phenomena. So before diving in, I'd like to just provide a content warning that this slideshow does include some explicit images of anti-Semitism. Yeah. So the rise of Web 2.0, the participatory web, has resulted in enormous changes to how we humans communicate, publish, and share information. Communication occurs almost instantaneously. The costs are comparably negligible to what we paid for in the past, and doing so is remarkably easy. Yet all these changes also apply to hate, bullying, and misinformation online. And there are features of the participatory web we can link to qualitative and quantitative changes to these extremist phenomena. The internet permits users to communicate with anonymity, allowing them to engage in hate, bullying, and the spread of misinformation online without risking the social capital they'd lose with similar behavior offline. This loss of risk contributes to a conjoined from the expectations of a civil society. Users may feel less inhibited when sharing abusive, absurd, and harmful material. In addition, since most online interactions don't involve seeing other people's in-person reactions, this results in a disassociation from any potential victims of such behavior. In addition, the online polarization of beliefs can contribute to further disassociation from opponents. Online polarization can lead to the creation of parallel realities. Social media algorithms push us towards like-minded people, creating information bubbles to suit our views. So if someone has a particularly hateful or misinformed view, they may get pushed towards communities that reinforce said views and creating a parallel reality with parallel facts about how the world works. So these features can apply to all forms of extremist hatred, bullying, and misinformation, notably on the far right. But that does pose a question. How is anti-Semitism different? So yes, anti-Semitism has changed due to the internet, but has it changed in additional ways compared to other forms of extremism and misinformation? So to understand how anti-Semitism differs online, we must look at its history. Anti-Semitism has been described as the longest hatred, a term coined by the late Robert Wistrich, due to its many iterations throughout history. This long, varied history has resulted in a range of tropes and resources that can be utilized even 1,000 years after their inception. One example of this longevity is the blood libel, a claim that Jews murder Christian children and use their blood in rituals. A key anti-Semitic resource that has also endured the test of time is, as mentioned before by Jordan, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery from the early 20th century that claims to represent a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Yet after World War II, many expressions of anti-Semitism were delegitimized, particularly after the education and commemoration of the Holocaust. In response, anti-Semites turned to denying the Holocaust, taking on a pseudo-academic facade to try and avoid accusations of anti-Semitism. While Holocaust denial gained traction, its reliance on public figures and their ensuing legal and financial woes resulted in the movement's decline. With the rise of Web 2.0, anti-Semitism evolved again, away from the sophistication of Holocaust denial and towards vulgarity, enabled by anonymity and other features of the participatory web. Meme culture, referring to the cultures surrounding the creation, distribution, and recycling of internet memes, has also been an avenue for advancing hate in a more explicit and vulgar form. However, there's a case to be made for a unique relationship between anti-Semitism and meme culture. This is one of the most famous anti-Semitic memes, called the so-called Happy Merchant. This meme was originally drawn by a white nationalist under the pseudonym A White Man, who made racist caricatures of other groups, notably African Americans and Mexicans. However, it was this anti-Semitic cartoon that took on a particular life and subculture of its own. And to date, there exists no other explicit hate-based meme that approaches the popularity, pervasiveness, and redistribution of this one. Memes are also used as avenues to reinvigorate old anti-Semitic tropes, such as the blood libel in this meme. So this meme was originally made to harass a Jewish journalist on Twitter while entertaining other users participating in the same harassment. Now, this meme is notable because it represents a continuation of an almost 1,000-year-old anti-Semitic trope, which is thus still serving a purpose for anti-Semites despite the distant religious context of its origins. As these examples suggest, anti-Semitism has evolved again to suit the new context of the digital age. Just as Holocaust denial evolved out of an anti-Semitic need, so do new online strategies serve to address the delegitimization of anti-Semitism following World War II and the Holocaust. One of these strategies is cloaking content, referring to content that is cloaking its discriminatory undertones. So Holocaust denial's pseudo-academic facade was an example of this. However, online anonymity, disassociation, and the breadth of online content significantly aids any attempt to cloak discriminatory intent. Anti-Semites will also attempt to colonize and occupy spaces used by nominally non-anti-Semites, particularly spaces with a strong emphasis on free speech like 4chan. By generating anti-Semitic content under the guise of dark humor, anti-Semitic humor can become normalized to these broader communities. Other users, even those who do not subscribe to anti-Semitic ideology, may even partake in the humor and stunts as a form of recreation. And over time, this can condition users of these spaces to put more stock into anti-Semitic ideas. The pervasiveness of the happy merchant meme is an indication of how prevalent anti-Semitic humor is compared to a lot of other forms of hate in these spaces. Information laundering refers to how anti-Semites can use interconnected spaces and movements to lend credibility to their own content, especially online. Organized anti-Semites have pushed this strategy quite hard, designing resources in more extreme spaces like 4chan or 8chan, and trickling the targeted content out into less extreme spaces to radicalize others, eventually, hopefully, trying to pull them into these more extreme spaces. Anti-Semites have, through this method, co-opted a wide range of reactionary movements, such as the misogynistic Gamergate movement mentioned by Simon. And these are used as key avenues for anti-Semitic recruitment. Another historic anti-Semitic trope, cultural Marxism, which is actually displayed in one of the images Jordan displayed from Clive Palmer's pages, helps enable this strategy. So the cultural Marxism conspiracy claims that there is a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Western civilization through subversive efforts in institutions and the media, often by supporting other groups and minorities subject to reactionary hate. The pre-existing history of this trope means that anti-Semites can then reach out into these reactionary movements in their spaces, expose followers to already existing material, which then confirms their biases and provides a worldview explaining their reactionary fears. The rising traction of cultural Marxism conspiracy theories demonstrates how anti-Semitism online can be a destination or an endpoint to hate and misinformation online. The wide pre-existing history of anti-Semitism allows for an easy construction of a worldview encapsulating a wide and possibly varied menagerie of reactionary and conspiratorial views. Yet anti-Semitism is not just potentially a destination, but also a foundation for far-right views online. Other campaigns of misinformation and hate follow templates long established by anti-Semitism. Some recent prominent examples are the Pizzagate and QAnon conspiracy theories, which are not what I would describe as explicitly anti-Semitic, although many of them do promote anti-Semitic ideas. Both these conspiracy theories allege the existence of a satanic conspiracy to kidnap children and ritually cannibalize and or sexually abuse them. These both follow the same themes as blood libel established almost 1,000 years prior. QAnon in particular also alleges as a worldwide conspiracy promoting this kind of campaign. And that conspiracy follows the same themes as Jewish conspiracy theories, as such presented in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Ultimately, anti-Semitism is a Western tradition, its long history resulting in its ideas being embedded in the social, religious, and cultural fabric of Western societies. As such, now in the digital age, it is this anti-Semitic foundation that provides the building blocks for a wide range of far-right conspiratorial and hate movements, gaining traction specifically due to the characteristics of Web 2.0. These changes mean we also have to revisit how we counter hate, abuse, and misinformation online. While extremists generally are not easily reasoned with even offline, parallel realities online serve to further indoctrinate them and make them more inaccessible from attempts to save them from radicalization. Previously, ignoring extremists may have served to deny them a platform, yet social media provides an audience to virtually anyone. In addition, through circulating extreme vulgar content, extremists can force colonizing these spaces. Finally, it's important to remember that content online can be stored in perpetuity. Not only does this allow the recycling of extremist content, but also any responses to that content. Extremist trolls use vulgarity to upset opponents in online debate, so to encourage outbursts that makes these opponents look comparatively unreasonable to undecided observers. So in order to counter extremism online, I have promoted the concept of inoculative resistance. Anti-Semitism, hate, and misinformation have been compared to a viral infection, and once infected, it's extremely hard to bring one back from the fringe. So our aim should not be to just necessarily reason with extremists, but rather those we could describe as immunocompromised, those who could potentially be persuaded by extremist content, but are not yet committed. Inoculative resistance is about encouraging and embedding online behavior in a wider population that serves to dissuade these fence sitters from falling down rabbit holes of extremism. So in order to test this concept, I ran a study where I posed as a Holocaust denier in a controlled online conversation. Participants, young Australians, would be unaware of the true nature of the study, believing it to be a relatively innocuous online discussion about anti-Semitism, and that I was just another participant. Through the ensuing discussions and surveys, I was able to search for predictors for psychological resistance, each participant's personal opposition to Holocaust denial, and inoculative resistance. How effectively have they encouraged each other or a hypothetical observer to not be persuaded by Holocaust denial? So in order to measure the degree of inoculative resistance, I developed the IRO indices, IRO standing for inoculative resistance online. Each index would measure counterproductive, unsuccessful, or productive behaviors in 4 fields. These 4 fields are the 4 R's, providing recognition, research, responses, and refutation to extremism, in this case, Holocaust denial, online. Regarding recognition, this is not about whether they personally recognize Holocaust denial as anti-Semitism. Some participants did, but they chose not to point it out, which would be an example of an unsuccessful behavior. These indices are about whether participants shared this understanding with the group. For recognize, a productive behavior would be stating or calling out the Holocaust denial as anti-Semitic, and counterproductive would be saying it is potentially wrong, but is acceptable and not anti-Semitic. A notable number of participants did the latter, saying that they thought Holocaust denial is ridiculous and misinformed, but argued that the pseudo-academic views of the denier did not constitute hate. Regarding research, productive behavior would be sharing research materials with the group, typically in the form of a link or a reference. Some participants did research to inform their responses, but without sharing the links, it was not as successful in providing inoculative resistance. Counterproductive behavior would cover presenting inaccurate sources, falsely accusing the Holocaust denial of fabricating sources, generally anything that regarding the use of sources might push an undecided observer towards the Holocaust denial. For response, productivity and counterproductivity was determined by how many arguments participants made against the Holocaust denier or Holocaust denial versus other participants. So this did not address the quality of such arguments, but their focus. Their reasoning for this being that if participants argue more against each other than Holocaust denial, which did happen on occasion, it risks giving the impression, especially to an undecided observer, that Holocaust denial is not particularly problematic. And finally, for refutation, productive behavior was effectively refuting the material. Counterproductive material covered making flawed arguments, or in some cases, actually supporting denial arguments. Interestingly, some participants did not overall agree with Holocaust denial, but were initially persuaded to accept some denialist talking points until they were refuted after the study. In addition, 2 discussion groups had actual Holocaust deniers participate. Ultimately, while psychological resistance or general opposition to Holocaust denial was expectedly high, inoculative resistance was mixed, suggesting a general inability of young Australians to effectively argue against Holocaust denial and potentially other forms of far-right extremism, and thus denying an ability to support vulnerable people from being influenced by it. The surveys carried out before and after determined that the most effective predictors for high inoculative resistance was a willingness to respond and confidence in refuting the material. Strong desire was also captured for more education, tools, and resources specifically addressing hate and their specific arguments. These initial results suggest that we need to shift our response to online hate towards in-depth education and encouraging calling out, stopping online colonization and recruitment. Finally, this study model and these indices were designed to be adopted to potentially any form of extremism online. This could potentially allow for further in-depth analysis of the links and comparisons between different forms of hate, misinformation, and extremism on the internet. And I think I will leave it there.
Great, thank you, Will. We've got around 10 minutes for question and answers, and we've got 3 already. Might start with this one for each of you 3. I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts or comments on the similarity of radicalization process between radical white nationalists or white supremacists and radical Islamists. Specifically, are any actions that the government may be taking to address the radicalization of far-right white supremacists? There are so many government efforts to de-radicalize and address the processes of Islamist radicalization, but I've heard of very few tangible actions to manage the white supremacist right. So are there any of these programs, these social efforts or government efforts to tackle the radicalization of the far right that each of you are aware of? Oh, please jump in.
Yeah, cool. Is that right?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks for that question, Alison. I think it's a very important one. I guess I'd start off by noting that just last week, ASIO actually put out a statement acknowledging that right-wing extremists were using, in their words, the same recruitment strategies as Islamic State was. I'd also note that that's something scholars on the far right have been saying for quite a few years prior to ASIO making that statement. Insofar as programs in Australia, you're right, there's not a whole lot. I'm not particularly familiar with what is going on. To me, a lot of it, I think, comes back to broader questions around programs of countering violent extremism, as well as broader research on white supremacy and the far right, and a question of objectives, right? Essentially, ASIO wants to stop violent attacks occurring. Obviously, that's a desirable objective. Are they necessarily wanting to address the underlying ideologies that feed into this, i.e. white supremacy in Australia? Probably not. And until we're willing to address things like that, I think it's very difficult to counter the recruitment narratives of these organizations.
Simon, Will?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that, there's absolutely, definitely connections that we can see between these two groups. Multiple, and Jordan is right that far right researchers have already been pointing out these connections for quite a long time, as have those who are researching into radical Islamists and jihadis as well. There's been this connection has been going on for a while, but some of the connections we can see, for example, in terms of those who become extremely violent or conduct attacks, misogyny is a very clear trend that runs through all of these, which is relevant to my own research, that you do see this very strongly. Histories of violence, domestic violence are very clear, but you also see similar recruiting narratives that are often tapping into disenfranchisement or tapping into social alienation, providing an in-group and presenting an out-group. These things are happening. These things are very connected. So the narratives are obviously different about why people are disenfranchised, about who is to blame for those things, but the style and the approach is very similar. One thing I would say in terms of organizations in Europe and the United States, there are some groups. They're often non-government groups that are partially funded by government groups that are working on de-radicalization programs in white supremacy. So in Europe, you have a group that is in multiple countries called Exit. They in particular work with people who are who've already sort of indicated a desire or willingness to get out of far right groups, and they provide them resources to do that, but they also encourage people to de-radicalize. And again, this is what's interesting about that for me is that a lot of the work they do is to provide them somewhere else to go. It's often not about tackling the ideology head on. It's about providing them somewhere else to go. It's often people who are seeing the hypocrisy in the ideology and giving them an out and giving them support services to get out. And that kind of stuff I don't think we see in Australia so much, and it'd be worthy of thinking about that.
Yeah, both of you have stated generally what I was thinking of, the same call out to the exit movement. Just kind of jumping on the tail end of Simon's comment. Yes, that when it comes to extremism, whether it is Islamic radicalization or white supremacy, there is just the general recognition that once you're far down that avenue, it's hard to intellectually de-radicalize someone. A lot of the efforts need to be are much more kind of indeterminate. They're a lot more based on emotional interactions and connectivity. This is a lot harder to really kind of measure in a kind of controlled context. And so we're going to be having to look at the long-term effects of some of these programs. But I think the exit movement in particular has some very promising approaches that could be used in Australia and other countries as well.
Can I just build on that? This actually goes to Hall's question about which, sorry, Ibrahim, I'm just going to facilitate for a second, but I think this connects to Hall's question about what makes young people susceptible to far right recruitment. I think that there is an ideological component around this, obviously, but I think Will is also correct in saying that there's a real emotional component. And so a lot of the work that Exit has done in Europe talks about the emotional component of people, for example, who feel socially alienated. I know I've used that word a lot, but for example, people who struggle at school, people who don't have friends, people who struggle with families, and far right groups come to them and they say, it's okay, this is the reason why this stuff is happening, but also we're going to be friends and we will be the first social group that you'll ever have. The first real social group. We'll act like your first friends. We'll invite you to all the cool parties. We'll invite you to all of these things. And there's a deep emotional connection to that. And often the research from Exit suggests that the way to get out is to provide them another place to land, another social group, another connections, other things. And it's often that emotional thing that gets people in, and it can be the emotional thing that gets people out at the same time.
Will or Jordan, do you have something to add on that question about the family context that might influence young people's susceptibility to the far right?
Look, I think Simon's pretty well covered it. I will just add there's extensive literature on right-wing extremism and belonging to far right movements more generally. Also, the emotional hate. This is normally something that is passed on family member to family member within the home. Young people, in many cases, kind of are brought up in these families where these ideas are normalized. And obviously that makes it very difficult to perhaps avoid it to begin with. I think also, and this speaks to Will's research really nicely, obviously this stuff was going on before the internet. The internet and Web 2.0 has made it particularly easy, and youths are being deliberately targeted by these movements. For example, if we think to the Daily Stormer, which is the most important, arguably, contemporary Nazi and white supremacist publication in the US and much of the Anglosphere. Their style guide was leaked a few years ago, and it talked explicitly of trying to target young people through ironic distance and humor. So they're very much in the sights there, I suppose.
The only thing I'll also add, agree with both these comments, is also worth keeping in mind the kind of the diversification of communities online, and in particular how people find connections and meanings to particular hobbies or interests, which can then be capitalized on extremists and far right activists by portraying those movements as under attack. And so Gamergate's a great example of this, where basically narratives were created that video gaming, or your idea of video gaming, is under attack. This is an attack on what seems to be a lot of people, their community, their family. There's been an evolution of these kind of communities, which opens up new avenues for radicalization and recruitment.
Yeah, and we see that in manosphere communities of just broadly men are under attack, and that sort of gives an emotional connection immediately.
Very quick question for Jordan. Do you have data about the left in Australia? How cohesive or heterogeneous is it? Trotskyism being a notorious byword for love and unity. What can you tell us, Jordan?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I just don't do it. Don't have it, unfortunately. Sorry about that, Hannah.
And for Will, how could your research be translated into policies that might improve responses to anti-Semitism or other far-right expressions online?
Yep, so potentially with repeated iterations of this study, what could be done is it could inform curriculum within schools, particularly about their understanding and in-depth examinations of particular hate movements. I feel like a lot of the behaviors instilled by any kind of case example within a school. Say, for example, a module within a class to look specifically at Gamergate or Holocaust denial or a particular version of hate, and critical examination of these beliefs and how to respond to them can instill appropriate behaviors against a far wide range of use of misinformation online. Another thing, just kind of on the side, which isn't exactly a policy, but I've been doing on the side, is that I've been replicating parts of this study as part of presentations for Jewish schools, where I go and get invited by the school, pose as a Holocaust denier, and then kind of refute everything I say and have this Q&A at both during the fake presentation and then after the real presentation. What this does is it serves to kind of hold up a mirror to people to be like, how are you reacting in these contexts? And is the way you're reacting particularly helpful? Is it going to be conducive to stopping this kind of movement? And I've had quite positive, so I think that might not necessarily be a policy, but the idea of giving some kind of interactive examples through an educational controlled context can help instill appropriate and helpful behaviors that undermines the effect of trolling and abusive behavior, and generally will also help make people's experiences online a little bit less traumatic.
Excellent. Well, let me thank Will, Jordan, and Simon. The last thing I want to say is on the 28th of October at 1 p.m., we are hosting again online the annual Alice Tay Lecture on Law and Human Rights. It's one of the annual lectures that the Freilich Project undertakes. And this year, Sarah Joseph from the Griffith Law School is going to be talking about COVID-19 and human rights. So COVID-19, it's a health emergency, but is it also a human rights emergency? So if you visit our website or our Facebook page or our Twitter page, then you can see details on that, and you can sign up for that. Once again, let me thank Simon, Jordan, and Will, and say good night to everybody. Go Cats.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for organizing it.
Good night.